man wants to sell you 40 acres for less than the price of a used truck, and he insists on doing the walkthrough himself instead of hiring an agent. And he does not leave your side for a single minute of the 4 hours you spend on his property. You are not buying a house. You are accepting custody of something. I did not know that on the day I signed. I know it now because the man who sold me the house is sitting in his kitchen 41 miles away, and he is the only person on earth who can explain what is living under my woodshed, and he will not pick up the phone. I should start at the beginning, because the beginning is the part that still looks normal in hindsight, and I want you to see how normal it looked. The listing was not online. I found it on a corkboard in a feed store off Highway 12 between a notice for a missing border collie and a hand-drawn ad for a man who would split firewood at $3 a cord. The listing was a single index card. 40 acres, 2-story farmhouse, well, septic woodshed generator, $89,000. A phone number written in pencil with the area code crossed out twice and rewritten. I called from the parking lot. The man who picked up said his name was Albert Halloran. He did not ask my name. He asked how soon I could come look. I said tomorrow. He said tomorrow was fine and that I should bring a flashlight because the daylight goes early up there in October. This was 3 weeks after the divorce closed. I had been living in my brother's basement on a fold-out couch, and my brother's wife had begun the slow, patient campaign of leaving dish soap and folded towels on the steps as a way of saying, without saying, that I had been there long enough. I wanted somewhere quiet. I wanted somewhere that did not have anyone else's footsteps over my head. I drove up the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a checkbook I had not used in 2 years. Halloran met me at the gate. He was maybe 70, tall, the kind of thin that comes from a life of walking instead of sitting. He wore a Carhartt jacket that had been mended at both elbows with leather patches. He shook my hand with a grip that was deliberate, neither hard nor soft, and he held on for a second longer than felt natural, the way an older man does when he's checking whether you are sober. He said, "Before I show you the house, I want to walk the line." I said, "The line?" He said, "The property line, so you know what you are buying." We walked it, all 4 sides. It took 2.5 hours. He pointed out the markers, old iron pipes driven into the ground 60 years ago, half buried in moss. And he showed me where the deer trails crossed the line and where the neighbor's cattle had once broken a section of fence and what year that had been. He talked the whole time. He talked about everything except the house. By the time we circled back to the front porch, I understood I had been given a tour of the woods so that I would not have time to give the house a tour of itself. The house was a 2-story cedar farmhouse, gone gray, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Inside, it was clean, cleaner than it had any right to be. The listing had described it as estate condition, lived in, sold as is. I had been picturing dust on the windowsills and mouse droppings in the cabinets. What I walked into was a kitchen with a working refrigerator, a bowl of apples on the counter, and a wood stove with kindling already laid in a teepee inside it ready for a match. I asked Halloran if someone had been keeping the place up. He said, "I come by every other week. I check on things." I asked if he had family on the land. He said, "No, sir, just me." He showed me the bedrooms upstairs and the den and the mudroom and the cellar steps that went down to a poured concrete basement with a chest freezer humming in the corner. He never let me get more than 1 room ahead of him. When I tried to open the freezer, he stepped between me and it, casual as a dance step, and said, "Empty. Unplug it if you want, save the power." We did not unplug it. The freezer was humming at a steady low note, and I noticed even then that the hum was a little louder than a chest freezer should be. Outside, he showed me the well and the propane tank and the wood shed and the generator shed. The generator was a diesel unit on a concrete pad. He said it had been serviced last spring. He said the diesel tank held 250 gallons and was currently 3/4 full, which would run the generator for a long time if you are careful. I asked why I would need to run a generator for a long time. The pole lines came right up the driveway. He said, "Power goes out in winter. It is good to have." I asked about the storm cellar. The listing had not mentioned one, but I had seen on the way back from the property line a concrete vent pipe sticking out of the eastern slope, painted the color of granite. It is the kind of thing you do not notice until you have noticed it, and then you cannot stop noticing it. Halloran's face did a thing. It is hard to describe. He did not change expression. The expression he was already wearing simply became a little more deliberate. The way a man's face does when he's being careful not to look at something across a room. He said, "Old root cellar. It is sealed. We do not use it." He said, "We." I let it go. I let a lot of things go that day. We went back to the kitchen and sat at the table, and he produced, from the inside pocket of his Carhartt, a folder of papers already prepared. Deed, title, septic certification, well log. He had a pen ready. He had a notary stamp from a notary who, he explained, was his cousin in town, and who would meet us at our office in an hour. Before I signed, he slid one more sheet across the table. It was a single page, typed on an actual typewriter, the kind that punches the periods into the paper. The header at the top said, in capitals, "Notes for the new occupant." There were 11 items on the list. Most of them were ordinary. The well draws slow in August. Run the tap for a full minute before drinking. The generator needs its oil checked every 40 hours of runtime. The chimney was swept in May. Sweep again before first snow. Mice will come in through the mudroom in November. Set traps along the baseboard, not in the corners. The propane gauge reads 10% low. Order at 30, not at 20. I read down the list. Halloran watched me read. He did not move while I read. The 7th item was underlined twice in pen. The pen had been pressed hard enough to score the paper. It said, "Do not remove the boulder behind the woodshed. Do not dig within 10 feet of it. Do not allow anyone else to do so." I looked up. Halloran was looking at the wall behind me, at a spot just over my shoulder, the way a man looks when he is waiting for a question he has been asked before. I said, "What boulder?" He said, "You will see it. It is a granite slab, about 6 feet high. It sits against the slope behind the shed." I said, "Why can't I move it?" He said, "Because the ground is unstable there. You move that boulder, the slope comes down on the shed. It is a safety matter. The previous owner found that out the hard way." I said, "I thought you were the previous owner." He said, "Before me." He held my eyes when he said it. I will give him that. He did not look away. But there was a small, specific pause between before and me that, in retrospect, was the size of a whole other sentence he had decided not to say. I signed. I drove home that night and packed the truck and came back 2 days later on a Thursday with everything I owned in 7 boxes and a duffel bag. Halloran was not there. He had left the keys under a flower pot on the porch, the way he had said he would. The kindling in the wood stove was still in its teepee, waiting for a match. I lit it. I made coffee on the gas range. I sat on the porch in a metal chair that had been left for me, and I listened to the firs ticking in the wind, and I understood for the first time in 14 months what silence sounded like when nobody else was on top of you. I want you to understand that first night I was happy. I went to bed at 10 in the upstairs bedroom that Halloran had pointed out as the warm one in winter. I did not sleep well, but it was the unfamiliar bed kind of not sleeping, the kind that has nothing to do with fear. I lay awake and listened to the house cool down around me, and somewhere around 2 in the morning I heard a sound I assumed was the chest freezer in the basement cycling on. It cycled on. It ran for a long time, long enough that, half asleep, I noticed it. Then it cycled off. Then 10 seconds later it cycled on again. A chest freezer does not cycle that way. A chest freezer cycles on for a while, gets cold, cycles off for a longer while. What I was hearing was a unit cycling on and off in even regular intervals, like a thing being switched. I went downstairs. I opened the basement door. I went down the steps with my flashlight. The chest freezer was not running. I stood at the bottom of the stairs in my socks and listened, and the hum I had been hearing was still happening, and it was not coming from the freezer. It was coming from underneath the floor. Not the basement floor. The basement was the floor. It was coming from under the concrete. I knelt down and put my ear to the slab. The concrete was warm. Not room warm. Warmer than that. A patch about the size of a dinner plate. In the corner under the stairs where the slab met the foundation wall, warm enough to feel through a sock if you stepped on it. The hum had a shape. It was not random. It was the hum of a machine that had been running for a long time and intended to keep running. I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember everything Halloran had said about the generator. He had said it ran on diesel. He had said the tank was 3/4 full. He had said it would run a long time if you were careful. The generator shed was outside, on a concrete pad, 40 feet from the house. Whatever was running under my basement was not the generator. I did not sleep again that night. I sat with my back against the headboard and waited for morning. And at first light, I went outside and walked to the path behind the woodshed and found the boulder Halloran had warned me not to touch. It was where he said, 6 feet high, granite, set into the eastern slope. Around its base, in the dirt, was a single fresh boot print, pointed away from the boulder toward the house. The print was longer than my own boot, wider across the ball. The tread was a pattern I did not recognize from any boot I had ever owned. And the print was deep enough that whoever had made it had been carrying weight. It had rained the night before last. The print was sharp-edged and unblurred. It had been made after the rain stopped. It had been made, in other words, while I was asleep upstairs, listening to the hum of a machine in the ground and convincing myself it was a freezer. I drove into town that morning to ask Albert Halloran what exactly he had sold me. He lived in a yellow ranch house off the main road with a truck in the driveway and a porch light still on from the night before. His wife answered the door. She was small and gray and tired in the way a person gets tired from waiting, not from working. I said I was looking for Albert. I gave my name. I said I had bought the property up the canyon last week. She did not look surprised. She looked like a person being handed a thing she had been holding the door open for. She said, "Come in, please. He has been expecting you." She walked me through the kitchen to a back room. Halloran was sitting in an armchair by a window with a cup of coffee gone cold on the table beside him. And when he saw me, his face did the same deliberate thing it had done at my kitchen table the week before. He said, "You were not supposed to read the 7th item until winter." I said, "What is in the bunker, Albert?" He looked at his wife. His wife looked at the floor. He said, "He is not ready for visitors yet. You were supposed to give him until the snow." I want to tell you what I did in the next 10 seconds, because what I did in the next 10 seconds is the reason I am still able to type this. I did not ask another question. I did not sit down in the chair he gestured me toward. I did not accept the coffee his wife was already moving toward the pot to pour. I stood in the doorway of that back room, and I looked at Albert Halloran. And I looked at his wife. And I looked at the cold coffee on the side table that had a skin on it from sitting too long, and I understood 3 things at once. The way you sometimes understand things when your body is faster than your mind. The first thing I understood was that they had been waiting for me. Not in the polite sense, in the literal sense. The wife had answered the door without asking who I was. She had used the phrase, "He has been expecting you." The coffee on the side table was cold because it had been poured for me before I knocked. The second thing I understood was that he, in the sentence, "he has been expecting you," was not Albert. Albert was sitting right there. The he was somebody else. The third thing I understood it was that whatever Albert was about to tell me, he was going to tell me in a way that made it my responsibility from the moment the words left his mouth. Once a man like Albert Halloran says a thing out loud to you in his own kitchen with his wife as a witness, you have been handed a thing. You cannot give it back. The transfer is the telling. I said, "I am going to step outside for a minute." Albert said, "Son, please sit down." I said, "I am going to step outside for a minute, and then I am going to come back, and you are going to tell me what is under my house. But first, I am going to step outside." I walked out through the kitchen and the front room and the front door, and I did not stop walking until I was at my truck. I sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the keys in the ignition and the engine off, and I put both hands flat on the steering wheel, and I made myself breathe in for 4 and out for 6, the way a counselor had taught me during the divorce. I did this 8 times. By the 8th time, I could think again. I had 2 choices. I could start the truck and drive. I could leave the property, leave the keys, leave the boxes I had already unpacked, eat the $89,000, and disappear into the rest of my life with a story I would never tell anybody because they would not believe it. That was the smart choice. That was the choice a man in a story like this is supposed to make, and the choice he never does. The other choice was to walk back into the house and let Albert Halloran tell me what he had sold me, because a thing you do not understand has more power over you than a thing you do. And because I had spent 14 months on a fold-out couch listening to my brother's wife clear her throat at the top of the stairs, and I had nowhere to drive to. I walked back into the house. Albert was still in the armchair. His wife had not poured the coffee. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she was watching the back door of the house, not me. The way a person watches a door, they expect somebody else to come through. I sat down in the chair across from Albert. I said, "Tell me." He did not start with the bunker. He started with his father. His father, he said, had bought the property in 1961 from a man named Ostlund, who had built the house in 1948. Ostlund was a Swedish immigrant who had been an engineer for the Army Corps during the war. And after the war, he had come west and bought 40 acres at the back of a canyon nobody else wanted, and he had built the house with his own hands over the course of 3 summers. Albert's father had bought the house from Ostlund for cash in the spring of '61, and Ostlund had moved out the next morning, and Ostlund had died in a motel in Bend, Oregon, 2 weeks later, of what the coroner called a heart attack, and what Albert's father, in private, had always called the relief. I said, "The relief from what?" Albert said, "From keeping him fed." He said it the way a man tells you the price of a thing he has already bought, without inflection, without explanation. As if I had been standing in the room for the previous 40 years and was simply being reminded. I waited. He said, "I am going to tell you the rest in order, because if I tell it out of order, you will stop me before I finish. And you need me to finish." I nodded. I do not remember nodding, but I must have, because he kept going. He said, "Ostlund did not build the house first. Ostlund built the bunker first. He built it in the summer of '46, the year after he came home. He built it before there was a road to the property. He hauled the concrete in by mule team, 2 bags at a time, and he poured the walls himself, and he sank the shaft himself, and he ran the ventilation himself, and the only person who ever helped him was a man named Pele, who was his cousin from the old country. And Pele went home to Sweden in '47 and never came back. The house came after. The house was built on top of the bunker the way a hat is put on a head. The house is the hat. The bunker is what the hat is for." I said, "What is the bunker for?" He said, "We will get there. Let me finish." He said, "Ostlund built the bunker for a Cold War that had not started yet. He had been an engineer. He had seen what was coming. He believed in 1946 that within 10 years there would be no surface left to live on, and so he built down. The way a man does who does not trust the sky. He built the first level himself. The first level is what you would call the bunker. It is the shelter. It is the room with the door you have already seen. And the boulder is in front of it because my father moved the boulder there in 1972 to keep my brother from going in. The first level is 40 feet deep. It is 20 by 30. It has a bunk and a stove and a chemical toilet and a hand-cranked ventilator. It is the part of the bunker that makes sense. He paused. He looked at his wife. His wife was still watching the back door. He said, "The rest of it does not make sense." I said, "The rest of what?" He said, "Ostlund did not stop at 40 feet. Ostlund kept digging. We do not know why. We have a guess. The guess is in a notebook of his that my father found in 1962 in a tin box behind the wood stove. And the notebook is in a safe deposit box at the credit union in town, and you will read it before you do anything else. But I will tell you the short version now." He said, "Ostlund kept digging because at 40 feet he found something he had not put there." The room was very quiet. The wife had not moved. Outside, a dog was barking 2 yards over, and the bark was a normal bark in a normal afternoon, and it sounded from where I was sitting like a recording of a world I had stopped living in. I said, "What did he find?" Albert said, "A door." He said, "Not a door he had built, a door that was already in the rock at the bottom of his shaft. A steel door set into the granite, with a frame around it that had been welded by somebody who knew how to weld, in a year before there were welders in this canyon. The door had a handle. The handle had been used. The metal around the handle was worn smooth. Somebody had been opening that door from the inside for a long time before Östlund ever broke through to it. I said that is not possible. Albert said, I know. He said, Östlund opened the door. We know he opened the door because he wrote it down. He wrote down what was on the other side of the door, and the description is in the notebook. And I will not tell it to you here, because you need to read it in his own handwriting, in a public building, in daylight, with another human being in the room. I will tell you only this. On the other side of the door, the bunker continues. It continues down. It continues for a distance Östlund tried to measure with a plumb line and a length of baling twine. And on the third night, he gave up measuring, because the twine had gone 512 feet without finding a floor, and he did not have any more twine. I said, 512 feet is not possible. The hill is not 500 feet tall. Albert said, I know. He said, Östlund sealed the door. He poured a concrete plug behind the door, 12 feet thick, and he set the boulder over the plug, and he built the house on top of the shaft, and he sold the house to my father. And my father did not believe any of it until the winter of 1967, when my father heard for the first time the hum that you heard last night. I said, how do you know I heard a hum last night? Albert looked at me for a long time. He said, because the hum starts on the second night. It always starts on the second night. It started for my father on the second night. It started for me on the second night when my father died and I moved in. It will have started for you last night. That is how we know who is next. I said, next for what? He said, next to feed him. He said the word him the way a man names an animal he has been raising in a barn for 30 years and has finally stopped pretending as a pet. I said, feed who, Albert? He said, we do not know his name. Östlund did not give us a name. Östlund only gave us a schedule. The schedule is in the notebook. The schedule is also on the 7th line of the page I gave you at the kitchen table, in the part you have not read yet, because the page has a backside, and you did not turn it over. I had not turned it over. I had not even thought to turn it over. I had read the 11 items on the front and signed and folded the page and put it in the kitchen drawer with the deed. Albert said, the schedule is simple. Once a month, on the night of the new moon, you take a bucket down the cellar stairs, and you set the bucket on the warm patch of concrete under the stairs, and you go back up, and you close the cellar door, and you do not open it again until morning. In the morning, the bucket is empty and rinsed. That is all. That is the entire job. My father did it for 58 years. I did it for 6. You are about to do it for as long as you live in that house, which, if you are smart, will be a very long time. Because the alternative is that you stop doing it, and then he comes up to look for the bucket himself, and he has only come up twice in the 80 years that any of us have been keeping the schedule. And both of those times, a person on this property went into the ground and did not come out. I said, what do you put in the bucket? Albert's wife behind me made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when they have been holding a breath for the length of a conversation, and the conversation has finally reached the part where the breath has to come out. Albert said, "Meat, raw, 5 pounds. It does not seem to matter what kind. We use beef, because beef is what the locker in town sells in 5-pound packages, and because the butcher does not ask questions if you are a regular." I said, "And if I do not." Albert said, "Then on the second new moon after you stop, the boulder behind the woodshed will be in a different place than you left it. And on the third new moon, the cellar door will be open in the morning when you come downstairs. And on the fourth new moon, you will not come downstairs, because by then he will already be upstairs, and he will already have decided which room you sleep in, and the room he decides on will not be a room you walk out of." He stopped talking. His wife finally poured the coffee. She set the cup down in front of me on a coaster that said Crater Lake Lodge, and her hand was steady. And she went back to the counter and folded her hands again and went back to watching the door. I picked up the coffee. I did not drink it. I held it because my hands needed something to hold. I said, "Albert, why did you sell the house?" He looked at me. He looked for the first time in the conversation like a man and not like a man delivering a speech. He said, "Because I am 73 years old. Because last winter, I slipped on the cellar stairs with the bucket in my hand, and I lay at the bottom of the stairs for 40 minutes before my wife came down and found me. Because the warm patch on the concrete was 4 feet from where I landed, and in the 40 minutes I lay there, I could feel him on the other side of the slab, waiting. And I understood, in those 40 minutes, that the next time I fell, I was not going to be able to crawl to the bucket. And I understood also that the schedule does not care. The schedule is the schedule. If I cannot keep it, somebody has to, and I have no children. And my wife will not stay in that house another winter, and I will not ask her to." He said, "I am sorry. I am sorry that I did not tell you on the day you signed. I told myself I would tell you in October, before the first new moon. And I told myself I would give you the choice. But I am a coward, son. And I waited, and you came to my door before I came to yours. And that is the only reason I am telling you now. If you had not come, I would have driven up there on the 29th with 5 pounds of beef in a cooler and a story about checking on the generator. And I would have put the bucket out myself, and I would have come home, and I would have told myself I would tell you next month. And next month I would have done the same, and 1 month I would have died on the way up the canyon, and you would have woken up on a morning in February and found the cellar door open, and you would not have known why." He stopped. He looked at the cold coffee that had been poured for me before I knocked. He said, "The new moon is in 9 days." I drove home. I do not remember the drive. I remember leaving Albert's house. I remember his wife touching my elbow at the door and saying very quietly, "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." 3 times, in the same tone, like a thing she had been practicing. I remember getting in the truck. The next thing I remember clearly is standing in my own kitchen in front of the drawer where I had put the deed, with the typed page in my hand, turning it over. The back of the page had 4 lines on it. The first line said, 5 pounds raw, beef preferred. The second line said, bucket only, no plate, no bowl, no bag. The third line said, cellar door closed by sundown. Cellar door not opened until sunrise. The fourth line said, he will hum to you on the nights you remember. He will not hum to you on the nights you forget. I read the 4 lines twice. I folded the page. I put it back in the drawer. Then I went down to the basement with a flashlight and I knelt on the concrete in the corner under the stairs, and I put my hand flat on the warm patch. The slab was warmer than it had been the night before. And underneath my palm, very faintly, on a beat I could feel through the bone of my wrist, somebody on the other side of the concrete was tapping back. I want to tell you about the 9 days between Albert Halloran's kitchen and the first new moon. Because the 9 days are the part of this story I was not supposed to survive, and I survived them by accident, and the accident is worth describing. The first thing I did when I came up from the basement that afternoon with my palm still warm from the slab was sit down at the kitchen table and make a list. I am not a list maker. I am a man who has, for most of his adult life, kept the important things in a place behind his forehead and trusted them to be there when he needed them. But what Albert had told me was a thing you cannot keep behind your forehead. It will not stay behind a forehead. It rolls forward and presses against the inside of your eyes until you take it out and put it on paper, and the paper is the only thing in the room that can hold it for you. I wrote down the schedule: 5 pounds, raw, beef preferred, bucket only, door closed by sundown, door not opened until sunrise. New moon, 29th of October, in 9 days. Underneath the schedule, I wrote the 4 questions I had not asked Albert in his kitchen, because I had not been able to think of them while I was sitting across from him. The first question was, what happens to the meat? The second question was, how do I know he stayed down there? The third question was, has anybody ever gone down to look? The fourth question I wrote down and then crossed out because writing it down felt like a small betrayal of the part of me that still wanted. At 20 minutes past 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday in October, to be the kind of man who would never write such a question. The fourth question, which I crossed out and then could not stop thinking about, was, what does he look like? I drove into town the next morning to the credit union. Albert had called ahead. The teller, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, did not ask my name. She asked for the number on the card Albert had given me at his front door, a card I had not noticed him pressing into my hand until I found it in my jacket pocket that night. She took the card. She came back from the back room with a long, flat metal box and a key on a coiled plastic cord. And she walked me to a small room with a table and a chair and a door. She closed behind me when she left. The notebook was inside the box. It was a black canvas-covered ledger, the kind a foreman keeps, with a cracked spine and pages that had gone the color of weak tea. The handwriting on the first page was small and slanted and disciplined, the way a man writes when he learned penmanship in a country that took penmanship seriously. The first page was dated July 14th, 1946. The first sentence in English said, "I am writing this in the language of my new country, because I do not want my mother to read it if she comes someday to find me." I sat in that small room for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I read the notebook from the first page to the last. I am not going to give you the whole thing, because some of it is private to a man who has been dead since 1961, and some of it is in Swedish, but I will give you the parts that mattered in the order I read them, because the order is part of what the notebook does to a person. Östlund had not been an Army Corps engineer. That had been Albert's softening of the truth, or his father's softening before him. Östlund had been a civilian engineer attached to a Swedish neutrality survey in 1944 that had quietly mapped, on behalf of 3 governments, the geological anomalies of northern Norway in the period when the Germans were withdrawing, and the maps the Germans left behind were, in places, wrong in ways that could not be explained by ordinary error. Östlund had been one of 4 men sent into a cave system near Kirkenes to verify a map. He had been the only one of the 4 who came out. He did not write down what happened in the cave. He wrote instead that he had spent the rest of 1945 in a hospital in Stockholm and had emigrated in February of 1946 with 1 suitcase and a notebook of figures, and that he had chosen the property at the back of the canyon because the granite there matched, in composition and bedding angle, the granite he had measured in Kirkenes. He had not, in other words, built the bunker for a Cold War. He had built the bunker because he had recognized the rock. He wrote that he began the shaft in May of 1946 and broke through to the steel door on the 17th of August. He wrote that the door was not, as Albert had said, welded. The door was fitted. The frame had been cut into the granite from the inside by a tool that left no marks Östlund could identify, and the door itself was an alloy he could not place. And the hinges were on the side facing him, which meant the door had been installed originally to be opened from his side by somebody who had expected a person to come through the rock from the surface and find it. He wrote, "The door was waiting for me, not for a man like me. For me, he opened the door on the night of the 18th of August, alone, against the advice of his cousin Pell, who left the property the next morning and did not return. What was on the other side of the door was a stairwell. It was a stairwell of the same alloy as the door. It descended at a regular surveyed angle. The treads were sized for a human foot. The handrail was at the height of a human hand. The walls of the stairwell were the alloy fitted into the granite so closely that Östlund, who had built things for a living, could not find a seam with the edge of a razor. The stairwell was lit. There was no fixture. There was no bulb. The light came from the alloy itself at the level of a full moon on a clear night, and it did not flicker, and it did not dim. And Östlund, who measured everything, measured the light with a photometer he had brought down on the second descent, and the reading was the same on the first step as on the 400th. He went down 472 steps on the first descent. He turned back at 472 because his lantern, which he had brought as a backup, had begun to feel heavy in a way a lantern does not feel heavy. And he understood that the heaviness was not in the lantern. He climbed back up. He sat at the top of the stairwell with his back against the open door for 2 hours, breathing before he could trust his legs to take him up his own shaft to the surface. He went down 11 more times over the next 3 years. He never reached a bottom. The deepest he went on the 11th descent was, by his count, 3,416 steps, and the stairwell, at 3,416 steps, was descending at the same angle and lit by the same light and walled in the same alloy as it had been on step 1. He came back up because his food ran out. He had brought food for 4 days. He had been on the stairwell for, by his watch, 6 hours and 40 minutes. When he reached the surface, the date on the calendar in his kitchen was 4 days later than the date he had left. He sealed the door in the spring of 1949. He did not seal it because of the time. He sealed it because on the 11th descent, he had not been alone. The notebook is careful here. Östlund was a careful man, and he was writing by 1949 with the awareness that somebody would read what he wrote, and he was choosing his words. He wrote that on the 11th ascent, somewhere past the 2000th step, he had become aware of a sound from below him on the stairwell. The sound was not footsteps. The sound was the sound of somebody keeping pace. The sound was always the same number of steps below him as he was below the door. When he stopped, the sound stopped. When he descended, the sound descended. When he finally turned and climbed, the sound climbed too at the same rate, behind him, and it followed him for the entire ascent. And it stopped exactly at the bottom of his own shaft, on the other side of the door, when he closed the door behind him and threw the bolt. It did not knock. It did not speak. It waited. Östlund wrote in Swedish a sentence that I had to ask the teller to translate when I came out of the room, because I did not trust my own translation. The sentence was, "He understands that I am the door, and the door is me, and he is willing to be patient." He poured the concrete plug in May of 1949. He set the boulder in place in June. He built the house on top of the shaft over the summers of 1949 and 1950. He moved into the house in the fall of 1950 and lived in it alone for 10 years and 7 months. He made his first delivery of meat on the night of the new moon in October of 1950, because in the spring of that year, while he was still pouring the foundation of the house, he had begun to hear a hum under his work site, on a beat that matched exactly the beat of the sound he had heard on the 11th ascent. And he had understood that the plug was not a seal. The plug was a wall. And on the other side of the wall, the thing that had kept pace with him on the stairwell had decided to wait there, because that was where Östlund was, and Östlund was the door. He wrote, "He cannot come through the plug, he can come through me. The meat is so that he does not have to." He did not explain the meat further. He wrote that he had tried in November of 1950, leaving nothing. He wrote that on the second night after the new moon, the boulder behind the woodshed had moved 6 inches to the south. He wrote that he had put the boulder back. He wrote that on the third night, the chest freezer in the basement had cycled on by itself, although it had not been plugged in, and that he had gone down to the basement and found the freezer humming on a beat that was not its own beat, and that he had unplugged it from the wall, and the humming had continued, and that he had understood then what was being asked of him, and that he had driven to a butcher in town the next morning and bought 5 pounds of beef shoulder, and that he had not missed a new moon since. The last entry in the notebook was dated March 3rd, 1961. It said in English, in handwriting that had begun to shake, "I am tired. I have written the schedule on a card and put the card in the kitchen drawer. The Halloran man has the cash. The Halloran man does not yet know what he is buying. I will tell him at the gate, on the day, if I have the courage. If I do not have the courage, the card will tell him. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I closed the notebook. I sat in the small room at the credit union for a long time with my hands flat on the table on either side of the closed notebook. And I thought about the wife of Albert Halloran, who had stood at her counter and said, "I am sorry, I am so sorry, I am so sorry," 3 times, in the same tone, in the same rhythm, like a phrase that had been passed down a line of people standing at kitchen counters since 1961. I drove home. I did not, on the drive home, decide what I was going to do. I want to be clear about that. I did not have a plan. I had a notebook full of a dead man's handwriting and a list on my kitchen table, and 9 days, now 8 days, until a new moon. And I had, somewhere underneath the things I was thinking, a question I had not yet allowed myself to think directly, which was the question of whether Östlund had been right. Östlund had been an engineer. Östlund had measured everything. Östlund had also, by his own admission, spent 6 months in a hospital in Stockholm in 1945, in a ward he did not name, after a thing happened in a cave in Norway that he never wrote down. Östlund had come to this canyon because he had recognized the rock. Östlund had built the bunker because he had been expecting the door. There is a version of this story in which Östlund was a sick man who built a hole in the ground and convinced himself over 40 years that the hole was talking to him. There is a version in which the hum under the basement is a geothermal vent, and the warm patch on the slab is a hot spring, and the boot print behind the woodshed is the boot print of a hiker who cut through the property at 3 a.m, and the schedule is a ritual that one tired old engineer started in 1950 and that 2 generations of Hallorans who were not sophisticated men kept up because they had been told to. There is that version. I want you to know that I considered that version. I considered it on the drive home, and I considered it that night, sitting on the porch with a glass of bourbon I did not drink. And I considered it in bed, lying on top of the covers, listening to the hum cycle on and off underneath the house at intervals that were not the intervals of any machine I had ever owned. I considered it until the morning of the 3rd day, when I went out to the woodshed to bring in firewood, and I found that the boulder had moved. Not far, maybe 2 inches, maybe 3. It was the kind of movement you would not have noticed if you had not, the day before, taken a piece of chalk and drawn a line in the dirt around the base of the boulder along its full circumference, the way a man draws a line around something he wants to be certain has not changed. The line on the eastern side of the boulder was buried. The line on the western side of the boulder was 3 inches into clear dirt. The boulder had moved toward the house, by itself, in the night, without sound, on a calendar day that was still 6 days from the new moon. Whatever was waiting on the other side of Östlund's plug was not waiting on Östlund's schedule anymore. Whatever was waiting on the other side of Östlund's plug had noticed that a new man had come, and had noticed that the new man had read the notebook and had decided on its own initiative to move the appointment up. I went into the kitchen. I picked up the phone. I called Albert Halloran. He answered on the first ring, the way a man answers who has been sitting next to a phone, waiting. I said, "Albert." The boulder moved. There was a long, slow breath on the other end of the line. He said, "How far?" I said, 3 inches toward the house. He said, "Stop the car if you are in it. Sit down if you are standing. I am going to tell you something, and you are going to need to be sitting." I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, in the same place I had sat on the first day, and I said, "Tell me." He said, "The boulder has only moved twice before in 80 years. The first time was in November of 1950 when Östlund tried to skip the first feeding. The second time was in February of 1972, when my father had pneumonia and could not get down the cellar stairs, and I was 9 years old and I did not know about the schedule yet. Both of those times, the boulder moved on the second night after a missed feeding. It did not move before the feeding. It has never in 80 years moved before the feeding. He said, "You have not missed a feeding. The new moon is in 6 days. You have not been given the chance to miss anything." He said, "Which means he is not moving the boulder because you have failed." I said, "Then why is he moving it?" Albert was quiet for a long time. I could hear through the phone the kitchen clock in his house ticking on the wall behind him. And I could hear, very faintly, his wife in another room, and I could hear, somewhere under it all, the hum from my own basement, which had been running for the entire phone call on a beat that did not belong to any machine I owned. Albert said, "He is moving it because somebody on your side of the plug has invited him." He said, "There is somebody on the property with you. There has been since the first night. The boot print you are going to find behind the woodshed in the morning is not going to be your boot. And it is not going to be his boot from underneath, because his boot does not come up through the plug. Somebody has been on the surface of your property since before you bought it. And he has been doing something to the boulder that is not in the notebook, and Osland did not know about him, and my father did not know about him, and I did not know about him, because for 80 years he did not need to do anything. The schedule was being kept. The plug was holding. He had no reason to move." He said, "He has a reason now. You are the reason. You are new, and you have read the notebook, and you are going to make a decision in the next 6 days, and whatever decision you make, he needs the boulder to be in a different place by the new moon than the place Osland put it." I said, "Albert, who is he?" Albert said, "I do not know. I have never seen him. My father saw him once in 1968 at the edge of the tree line at dusk, and my father came inside and locked the doors and did not go outside again until morning. And my father would not tell me, ever in 50 years, what the man had looked like. My father told me only one thing. He told me that the man was not waiting for the schedule. He told me that the man was waiting for the schedule to end. He said, 'Son, listen to me. There are 2 things in the ground on that property, and they want different things. And for 80 years, they have been at a stalemate because Osland built a system that fed the one and ignored the other. You are about to break the stalemate. You cannot avoid breaking the stalemate. The only choice you have is which one of them you break it in favor of.' He said, 'I am going to drive up tonight. I am going to bring the meat. I am going to do the first feeding myself on the new moon with you in the room so that you see how it is done. After the feeding, you and I are going to sit on your porch with a shotgun across my knees, and we are going to wait for the man behind the woodshed to come and look at the boulder. And when he comes, you and I are going to have a conversation with him.' He said, 'Do not go outside before I get there. Do not go in the basement. Do not look at the boulder again. Sit in your kitchen with the doors locked and the lights on and wait for my truck. I will be there before sundown.' I said, 'Albert, how long is the drive from your house to mine?' He said, 41 miles, an hour and 10 minutes if the road is dry. I looked at the clock on the wall of my kitchen. It was 3 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. I said, 'I will see you at 3:30. He said, 'You will see me at 3:15. I am already in the truck.' He hung up. I sat on the kitchen floor with the phone in my hand, and I listened to the dial tone. And underneath the dial tone, very faintly, on the same beat as before, the hum from the basement was still going. And now, for the first time, the hum had a second layer to it. The second layer was not under the floor. The second layer was outside the kitchen window, behind the woodshed at the base of the boulder. And it was the sound of a shovel, very softly, being pressed into dirt by somebody who was not in any hurry, and who knew exactly how much time he had before Albert Halloran's truck came down the gravel drive. The sound of the shovel did not stop when I stood up. I want you to understand something about that sound, because the sound is the part of this story I have the hardest time writing. A shovel in dirt is one of the most ordinary sounds a man can hear. I have heard it 1,000 times in my life, in gardens and at grave sites and on construction crews in my 20s. It is not on its own a frightening sound. What made the sound frightening on the afternoon of the third day was the rhythm of it. It was not the rhythm of a man digging. A man digging puts the shovel in, leans on it, lifts a load, throws the load, and puts the shovel in again. There is a working pause between each cycle. The pause is the lift. The pause is where the body pays the cost of the work. There was no pause in the sound behind my woodshed. The shovel went in, and it came out, and it went in again on a beat as steady as a metronome. And the beat did not slow down, and it did not speed up, and it did not vary by a fraction of a second from one cycle to the next. For the entire time I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the corner of the woodshed. I could not quite see around. I could not see him. The angle was wrong. I could see the western corner of the shed and the path that ran past it, and the first fringe of the firs beyond it. And I could see the dirt path lit up by the cold, flat October light. And I could not see, from any window in my house, the eastern side of the shed where the boulder was. And I understood, standing at the window with the phone still in my hand, that the man behind the woodshed had chosen his position, because he knew exactly which windows of my house could and could not see him. He had been on this property for a long time. I did not go outside. I do not want to make myself sound brave, because I was not brave that afternoon. I was a man who had been told 20 minutes earlier by a 73-year-old retiree on a phone to sit in his kitchen with the doors locked. And I sat in my kitchen with the doors locked, because I did not have a better idea. And because the part of me that wanted to walk outside and confront a stranger on my own land was a part I had been raised to listen to, and the part of me that had read Osland's notebook that morning was a part I had not been raised to listen to, and on that afternoon the second part won. I locked the kitchen door. I locked the mudroom door. I went through the house, room by room, and locked every window, including the ones upstairs that nobody could have reached without a ladder, because Osland had written in the notebook that the thing on the other side of the plug had not made a sound on the stairwell. And I understood it now, that anything which could move without sound on a stairwell could probably also move without sound on a roof. I went back to the kitchen. I sat at the table. I put the phone on the table in front of me. I watched the second hand of the wall clock and listened to the shovel. The shovel went on for 41 minutes. At 41 minutes, it stopped. It did not stop. The way a man stops when he is finished. A man finishing a job sets the shovel down, exhales, takes a step back, makes some small human sound. The shovel behind my woodshed stopped on a downbeat between cycles in the middle of the rhythm, the way a recording stops when somebody pulls the plug. 1 second there was the sound. The next second there was no sound. The silence after it was a worse sound than the shovel had been, because the silence meant he was now doing something else, and I did not know what. 3 minutes after the shovel stopped, I heard a truck on the gravel drive. I went to the front window. It was Albert's truck. It was a green Ford from the late 90s, with a dent in the passenger side door, and Albert was driving it with both hands on the wheel and his head tilted forward like a man peering through fog, although the afternoon was clear. He pulled up in front of the porch, and he did not get out right away. He sat in the cab for 30 seconds with the engine running and his hands on the wheel, and he looked very carefully at every window of my house, one by one, and at the woodshed, and at the tree line, before he killed the engine. He got out with a shotgun across his forearm, broken open. The way a man carries a shotgun, he wants you to know, is not loaded yet. In his other hand was a white plastic 5-gallon bucket with a red lid. I unlocked the front door before he reached it. He came inside and I closed the door behind him and I locked it. And he went to the kitchen and set the bucket on the table and the shotgun on the counter, and he said, "Tell me what you heard." I told him about the shovel. I told him about the rhythm. I told him where the sound had come from and how long it had lasted and how it had stopped. Albert listened the way a doctor listens to a patient describing a pain. He did not interrupt. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, 41 minutes. I said, yes. He said, he has not dug for 41 minutes in 80 years. He digs for 9. 9 minutes every fourth Sunday at 4 in the afternoon behind the woodshed on the eastern side of the boulder. My father timed it for 30 years and never saw it vary. I timed it for 6 and never saw it vary. 9 minutes. He sat down at the table and put both palms flat on the wood and looked at the bucket. He said, 41 minutes is a different job. I said, what was the 9-minute job? He said he was packing the dirt around the boulder, tamping it, making sure the boulder did not move. He was for 80 years doing the same job we were doing on the inside from the outside. He was helping us hold the plug. I said, and the 41 minutes. Albert said, I do not know, but I can guess. He said, if a man has spent 80 years tamping dirt around a stone to keep it in one place, and one afternoon he decides to dig for 41 minutes instead, he is not tamping anymore. He is loosening. He is making a hole the boulder can fall into when somebody pushes it from the other side. I said, you said earlier he was waiting for the schedule to end. Albert said, I said my father told me that. I have thought for 50 years that my father was wrong. I have thought that the man behind the woodshed was an ally. I have thought that he and Osland had an arrangement that Osland did not write down, and that the digging on Sundays was part of the arrangement. I have been comfortable thinking this because it has been convenient, and because for 50 years nothing has happened to make me think otherwise. He looked up from the bucket. He said, I was wrong. My father was right. He has been waiting. He has been holding the boulder in place for 80 years, not because he wanted it to stay there, but because he was not yet ready for it to come out. He is ready now. You arriving has made him ready. I do not know why, and I am not going to pretend to know. We can ask him in about 3 hours if we are still alive at sundown. He stood up. He said, help me carry this to the cellar. I said, the new moon is in 6 days, Albert. He said, the new moon was in 6 days this morning. The boulder moved this morning. The schedule is broken. We are not feeding him on the new moon. We are feeding him now, before the man behind the woodshed finishes his hole. We are going to get one feeding into the slab before sundown, and we are going to hope with everything we have that it buys us until tomorrow. And we are going to figure out what to do tomorrow with daylight. I picked up one handle of the bucket. He picked up the other. The bucket was heavier than 5 pounds. I asked him about it on the stairs. He said 10 pounds, 2 cuts. I bought double on the way up, in case. We went down the cellar stairs. The basement was colder than it had been that morning. It was colder than the kitchen above it by, I would guess, 15 degrees, and the cold was not the cold of an unheated room. It was the cold of a room that had been deliberately cooled. My breath was visible. Albert's breath was visible. The air had a faint smell to it that had not been there in the morning, a smell I am going to describe and then ask you to forgive me for, because the smell is one of the things about that afternoon that I will not be able to forget for the rest of my life. It smelled like wet pennies and old wool, and something underneath both of those that was almost sweet. It smelled like a room where somebody had been waiting a long time without moving. The warm patch in the corner under the stairs was no longer the size of a dinner plate. It was the size of a card table. The concrete in that area was dry where the rest of the slab was damp. And it was the color of concrete that has been heated for a long time from below. A pale gray that was almost white. And at the very center of the patch, on the spot where I had laid my palm the day before, the slab had developed a hairline crack. The crack was about 4 inches long. It was not a crack from settling. A settling crack is jagged and follows the stress lines of a slab. This crack was straight. It ran in a single clean line from one edge of the warm patch to the other, and at one end of it, where the crack terminated, the concrete had risen up against itself by a fraction of an inch, the way a fingernail rises when something is pushing it from underneath. Albert saw the crack and stopped on the bottom step. He did not say anything for a long moment. He set down his side of the bucket very carefully on the bottom step, and he straightened up, and he put his hand on the railing to steady himself. And I saw, for the first time since I had met him, that Albert Halloran was afraid. He had not been afraid in his kitchen. He had not been afraid on the phone. He had not been afraid getting out of the truck. He was afraid now. He said very quietly, "Set the bucket down. Step back." I set the bucket down on the bottom step next to his. He said, "The slab has never cracked in 80 years. Not once." Oslin poured that slab over the plug, and the plug is 12 feet of concrete, and the slab is a foot of concrete, and between them is supposed to be solid rock, and that crack is in the slab, which is the top foot, and that crack is fresh. He said, "Whatever is on the other side of the plug has come up the 12 feet of the plug." He said, "It is now under our slab." He said, "It is now 4 inches of concrete from this room." I do not know what I would have done in the next 60 seconds if Albert had not been with me. I want to think I would have backed up the stairs the way you back up from a snake on a path, but I do not actually know. What happened with Albert there is that Albert reached down and picked up his side of the bucket and said, "Help me." And we carried the bucket the 4 steps from the bottom of the stairs to the warm patch, and we set it on the slab directly over the crack. And Albert reached down and took the red lid off the bucket and stepped back. The smell that came out of the bucket was the smell of raw beef. Just that. Nothing more. It was after the smell of the basement, almost a relief. We went back up the stairs. Albert closed the cellar door behind us. He turned the key in the cellar door, which was a key I had not known the cellar door had, and he handed me the key. He said, "From now until sunrise tomorrow, this door does not open." He said, "If you hear something, you do not open it. If I tell you to open it, you do not open it. If your own mother is on the other side of it asking you to open it, you do not open it. We are going to sit on the porch now, and we are going to wait for the man behind the woodshed." We went to the porch. Albert loaded the shotgun on the porch. He did it slowly with his fingers in the cold, flat light of the late afternoon. The way a man loads a weapon when he wants the act of loading to settle his hands. He put 4 shells in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, and closed the action and laid the shotgun across his knees. He said, "I have not fired this gun since 1989. I said, "What did you fire it at in 1989? He said, "A coyote in my backyard in town. I missed." He said it without smiling, and I did not smile either. The sun was about an hour from the ridge. The light on the firs was the orange gold light that comes in October at that latitude, and the wind had dropped, and the property was, for the first time since I had bought it, completely silent. No hum, no shovel, no birds. The chickadees that had been at the feeder on the porch rail every morning since I moved in were not at the feeder. The feeder swung very slightly on its hook in a wind I could not feel. Albert said, "He is going to come from the tree line. He is not going to come from the woodshed. The woodshed is his work site. He does not enter the property from his work site. He enters from the southwest, where the firs come closest to the porch, because that is the only line of approach that is not visible from the kitchen window or the upstairs bedrooms. My father saw him there in 1968. I have been waiting on this porch for 50 years to see him there myself. I would like very much for you to do the talking when he arrives, because I am an old man, and old men say the wrong things when they are afraid, and I am afraid." I said, "Albert, I do not know what to say to him." Albert said, "Ask him his name. Start there. A man who will tell you his name is a man you can talk to. A man who will not is a man you shoot." He said it the way a man says a recipe. We waited. The light moved. The shadow of the woodshed lengthened across the dirt path until it touched the bottom step of the porch. The shadow of the firs at the southwestern edge of the property crept across the lawn in a long, slow, even sweep. And at the moment the shadow of the tallest fir reached the porch railing, a man stepped out of the tree line. He did not walk out. He stepped. One step. He had not been there. And then he was there, at the edge of the firs in the long shadow about 60 feet from the porch. He was tall. He was thin. He was wearing a barn coat and work pants and tall rubber boots, caked in pale clay. His face, at 60 feet, was a face I could not quite resolve, because the light was behind him and his hat was pulled down. But I could see from the way he held his head that he was looking directly at us, and I could see from the way his hands hung at his sides that he was not holding the shovel. He had left the shovel behind the woodshed. He had left the shovel behind the woodshed because he no longer needed it. Albert raised the shotgun off his knees, slowly, without lifting it to his shoulder, and rested the stock against his thigh. The man at the tree line raised one hand. He raised it slowly, palm out, the way a man does who wants you to know he is unarmed. He held the hand up for a long second. Then he pointed with one long finger at the ground in front of his own boots. He wanted us to come to him. Albert, beside me, breathed out through his nose. Albert said very softly, without taking his eyes off the man, "He has never done that before." I said, "Done what?" Albert said, "Asked." Albert did not stand up. He shifted the shotgun half an inch on his thigh, which was the most movement I had seen from him since we sat down. And he said very quietly, without taking his eyes off the figure at the tree line, "We are not going to him. He is going to come to us, or he is going to leave." The figure did not leave. He lowered his hand. He took one step forward out of the long shadow of the firs into the open lawn. The light caught his face for the first time, and I saw in the half second before my mind refused the information that the man at the edge of my property was not a man in his 60s or 70s, the way I had been picturing the shape of him. He was older than that. He was older than Albert. He was older than anybody I had ever stood in a room with. His face had the kind of stillness that does not come from calm. It comes from a face that has not had to make an expression in a long time. He took a second step, a third. He walked toward the porch at a slow, deliberate pace, without urgency, without effort, the way a man walks who has already decided the conversation is going to happen, and the only question is how far he has to come to have it. When he was 20 feet from the porch, Albert raised the shotgun to his shoulder. He said, "That is far enough." The man at 20 feet stopped. He looked at Albert. He looked at me. He looked for the longest beat at the shotgun. Then he opened his mouth, and he spoke. And his voice was not the voice I had been preparing myself for. It was a thin voice. It was the voice of a man who had not used his throat to make sound in a long time, and was relearning it as he went. He said, "Halloran?" Albert said, "Yes." The man said, "Your father knew me." Albert said, "My father is dead." The man said, "I know. I watched the truck come up the canyon in 2019. I watched you carry the box out of the house in 2019. I have been on this property longer than your father was on this property, Halloran. I have been on this property longer than anyone has been alive in your family." Albert did not lower the shotgun. He said, "What is your name?" The man said, "Pele." The name landed in the air between us like a stone dropped on a wood floor. I had read the name in the notebook that morning. Pele was Oslin's cousin. Pele had helped him pour the bunker. Pele had gone home to Sweden in 1947 and never come back. Pele had not gone home. Pele had been here the entire time. Oh, I said before I knew I was going to say it that you went down with him. Pele's eyes moved to me. The eyes were the wrong color for a face that old. They were a clear, unclouded gray. They were the eyes of a man in his 30s. He said, "On the 7th descent," he did not write it down. He did not write me down for any of the descents, because I asked him not to. I went with him on the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th. On the 9th, I did not come back. He said he came back. He sealed the door. He poured the plug. He built the house. He sold the house. All of this is true. What is also true is that on the 9th descent, I sat down on a step at 1240. And I told him I was not climbing back up. And he climbed back up without me. And he sealed the door behind him. And he has, in 80 years, never written my name in any of his books. I said, "Then how are you here?" Pele said, "I came up another way." He said it without inflection, the way a man names the road he took to town. He said, "There is more than one door, Halloran. Oslind found the first one. There are others. The stairwell does not only go down. At certain depths it goes sideways. At certain depths it comes up. I came up eventually into the root cellar of a farmhouse in Saskatchewan in 1953. I walked from there. It took me a long time. I have been on the surface since in a number of places. I came back to this property in 1968 because I owed your father a conversation that I was not in 1968 ready to have. I have been working on the boulder since then because I needed the boulder to be in a particular condition before I had the conversation, and I was not in a hurry, because none of you were. Albert had not lowered the shotgun. The barrel was steady. I could see from the side the muscle in his jaw working. Albert said, "What is the conversation?" Pelle said, "The thing on the other side of the plug is not what Oslind thought it was." He said Oslind thought it was a creature. He thought it was patient. He thought it ate. He fed it because he was a Swedish engineer. And a Swedish engineer, when he encounters a thing he does not understand, builds it a schedule. The schedule has worked for 80 years. The schedule has worked because the thing on the other side of the plug has allowed it to work. The thing on the other side of the plug does not eat. The thing on the other side of the plug does not need to eat. The thing on the other side of the plug has been accepting the meat for 80 years as a courtesy because Aslan built the schedule with such care, and because the thing on the other side of the plug is, in its own way, polite. He said, "What is on the other side of the plug is me." I felt the porch tilt under me. It did not actually tilt. Something in my inner ear made the world go briefly wrong, the way it does on a boat the moment you understand you are seasick. And I had to put one hand on the porch railing to stay upright. Pelle said, "When I sat down on the step at 1240, I did not stay there. I went further down." The stairwell continued. I continued. There is no bottom, Halloran. There is no bottom. The stairwell goes for as long as you walk, and the walking does not tire you, and the light does not change. And at some point you understand that the stairwell is not a stairwell. The stairwell is the inside of something, and the something is shaped like a person. And the further you go, the more you become the inside of the shape, and the shape is mine. He said, "I am the plug. The concrete is decoration." Aslan poured 12 feet of concrete over a hole, and the hole has been held closed for 80 years. By me, on the other side, with my back against the door. The meat was for the part of me that came up to Saskatchewan in 1953. The meat is so the surface part does not get hungry. The surface part is what you are looking at now. The surface part is what has been digging behind your woodshed. He raised both his hands, palms out, the way a man does when he wants you to see he is empty. He said, "I am tired, Halloran. I have held the door for 80 years. I came back to this property because I am ready to let go of it. I cannot let go of it while the Halloran is feeding the schedule. The schedule keeps me here. As long as the schedule continues, the part of me on the other side of the plug remains attentive. And as long as the part of me on the other side of the plug remains attentive, the part of me on this side cannot leave. I have been loosening the boulder so that when you stop feeding, the plug can fail cleanly, and I can step off the door, and I can go where the rest of me has been going for 80 years, which is wherever I want." He said, "I am asking you to stop. I am asking you, as a favor, to put down the bucket. I have been asking your family for 50 years. I am asking you now in person because Albert is the last of you, and because the man beside Albert is new, and because if I do not ask now, I do not know that I will have another chance." He lowered his hands. He stood at 20 feet with his hands at his sides and waited. The shotgun in Albert's hands had begun, very faintly, to shake. I said, "Albert." Albert said, "I heard him." I said, "Albert, the slab." Because while Pell had been speaking, I had been standing on the porch with one hand on the railing, and through the floorboards under my feet I had been feeling, at first, faintly and then unmistakably, the sound of the basement. The hum had stopped. The hum had been replaced somewhere underneath us by a slow, wet, grinding sound, as of a piece of stone moving against a piece of stone. The sound was not coming from behind the woodshed anymore. The sound was coming from directly under our feet. Albert's eyes flicked, for the first time, off Pelle. He looked down at the porch. That was when Pele moved. He did not run. He did not lunge. He took one long step forward, as if he had been waiting for the look down, and on the step his boot came down on the lawn, and the lawn where his boot landed made a sound a lawn does not make. It was the sound of a drumhead. The ground under the lawn, for one instant, sounded hollow. Albert pulled the trigger. The shot was loud in a way I had not been ready for. The shotgun bucked. Pele did not fall. Pele did not stagger. Pele looked down at his own chest, where a fist-sized hole had opened in the front of the barn coat. And through the hole, I could see, very clearly, in the late afternoon light, the trees behind him. The hole did not have a body in it. The barn coat had a hole. The man in the barn coat did not. Pele looked up at Albert. He looked for the first time since he had stepped out of the shadow, almost sad. He said, "I am sorry, Halloran. I came to ask." He took a second step. The boulder behind the woodshed came down. I did not see it come down. I heard it. It was the sound of a piano falling onto a wooden porch from a great height, multiplied, sustained, and underneath it the granular crack of a concrete plug that had been holding for 76 years, finally giving up the geometry of holding. The shed beyond the kitchen window lifted 6 inches off its foundation and settled crooked. A thin gray dust came up over the roof of the shed in a column and hung there in the still air. In the basement directly under the porch, the slab cracked open with a sound like a rifle. Bella smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of a man who has, after a very long time, been told he can go home. He said, "Thank you." He turned. He walked at the same slow, deliberate pace he had walked toward us, back across the lawn, into the long shadow of the firs, and at the edge of the firs he did not step into the trees. He stepped into the air between 2 trees, and the air between the trees, for a moment, was not air. It was a doorway. He went through it. The doorway closed. The firs ticked once, in a wind that did not exist, and were still. Albert dropped the shotgun. He sat down on the porch and put his hands over his face and made a sound that was not crying exactly. It was the sound a man makes when a thing he has been carrying for 50 years is suddenly not in his hands anymore, and his hands, without it, do not know what they are for. I drove him home that night. We did not speak on the drive. His wife met us at the door, and she looked at his face, and she did not ask. She took him inside. She closed the door. I stood on her porch for a moment in the dark, and then I got in my truck, and I drove back to the property because I had nowhere else to go and because I needed, before sunrise, to see the basement. I went down the cellar stairs with a flashlight. The bucket was where we had left it, on the warm patch of slab. The bucket was empty. It was not rinsed. The meat was simply gone, and the bucket was dry, the way a bucket is dry that has never had anything in it. The crack in the slab was closed. It had not been repaired. It had not been patched. The concrete, where the crack had been, was a single unbroken surface, and when I knelt and ran my palm over it, the slab was room temperature. The warm patch was gone. The hum was gone. The smell of wet pennies and old wool was gone. I sat on the basement floor for a long time, and then I went upstairs, and I slept. And in the morning I packed my truck. I have not been back to the property. I sold it the following spring at a loss to a young couple from Portland who wanted a fixer-upper. And I did not tell them about the bucket, and I did not tell them about the boulder, and I did not tell them about the 7th line on the back of the page in the kitchen drawer, because the page was no longer in the drawer when I went to look for it on the morning I left. And the drawer was empty. And the deed was empty. And the kitchen was the kitchen of a house in which nothing had ever happened. I live in an apartment now. It is on the 4th floor of a building in a city. There is no basement under my unit. There is no slab. Last month, on the night of the new moon, I came home from work and put my groceries on the counter. And I felt, through the soles of my shoes, on the linoleum of my kitchen, a single warm patch, the size of a dinner plate, in the corner near the refrigerator, where the floor should have been the same temperature as the rest of the room. I have not stood in that corner since. I have, in the 4 weeks since, bought a new freezer. I keep it in that corner. I keep it stocked. On the night of the new moon, I open the freezer door, and I take out a 5-pound package of beef shoulder, and I leave it on the warm spot on the floor, and I close the kitchen door behind me, and I do not open it again until sunrise. In the morning, the package is gone, and the floor is room temperature, and the kitchen door is closed, exactly as I left it. Except this morning when I came into the kitchen, there was a single fresh boot print on the linoleum in pale clay, pointing away from the warm spot toward the front door of my apartment. The boot was longer than my own. The tread was a pattern I did not recognize, and the front door, which I had locked from the inside before I went to bed, was standing open by the width of a coin.